Today, I would like to talk to you about the greatest threat to capitalism. And I want to actually say first that when I talk about the greatest threat to capitalism, I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about the greatest threat to all freedom, right? I'm talking about something, oops, sorry, specifically to one area, economic freedom, right? So what is the greatest threat to capitalism? I think many of us here would agree that capitalism for years has been under attack. But I would argue that actually it is not probably the most under attack by those you think. So for instance, many people in the US, you hear this say, you know, the biggest threat to capitalism is terrorism. The biggest threat to capitalism is wealth inequality. The greatest threat to capitalism is national debt. And I agree that all these are threats, but they're not the greatest threat. I would also argue that the greatest threat to capitalism is not even the particular platforms of a given politician, whether they be in the US, President-elect Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, or in France, François Hollande, Marine Le Pen, and whomever you consider super anti-liberal in the classical sense of the term in the UK. The biggest threat to capitalism, on the other hand, is government favoritism, is privilege, is actually government favoring particular capitalist. This government favoritism is a result of the unholy alliance between businesses, big businesses often, and the government. And it has yielded a perverted form of capitalism that isn't capitalism at all. It is more what we call cronyism, crony capitalism, government-granted privileges, a lot of names. Among free market people, we've had this big fight about how we should call it, and I'm kind of like always reminded by people when I use one word as opposed to the other that I'm using the wrong word, but so crony capitalism, right? So think about our cultural attitude towards capitalism. And this is important because politics, right, is downstream of culture. So the way our culture portrays capitalism is important. It seems, and it's been going on for a long time, that you can't read the paper, you can't go to church, you can't go to the movies without seeing capitalism being disparaged, right? However, the problem is like many of these criticisms are misdirected at capitalism, right? What they actually should be directed at as this crony capitalism is corporatism. So for instance, think about in the US, Elizabeth Warren, right? She has been a senator from Massachusetts since 2012, so it hasn't been a long time, but man, it's felt like it's been a long time. That being said, as much as I disagree with the senator on almost everything, there is something I agree with her about, is like very often she does identify and she calls out the incredible power that Wall Street seems to have, and in particular, this revolving door phenomenon. The fact of big Wall Street executive getting big bonuses as they exit their private firm to go work for the government, right? I mean, I agree with her that this is a concerning phenomenon. That being said, I think she misunderstands what the real problem is. The real problem is that government employees have incredible power that can make or break a Wall Street firm. And as a result, right, firms have an incentive to actually have one of their allies in these government jobs, either to try to protect their industries against the reach of government, or, better yet, try to get a special privilege for their firms, right? Still, Senator Warren is like going nuts right now because yet again, a Secretary of Treasury appointed by elected President-elect Donald Trump, I mean, but he's one of many, is coming from Goldman Sachs, right? I mean, this is just one of a long series. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that for all the prediction of doom and gloom by the Democrats, talking about the election of Trump on the market and recession and the collapse of the economy, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, all these big Wall Street firms, their stocks have been on a tear like since Donald Trump was elected. And I actually suspect that with this appointment of another former Goldman Sachs executive, it's going to continue, right? But so what Senator Warren is actually kind of misrepresenting is like it's not the reason why there's this incentive to actually try to get these government jobs is because of the existence of government. If the government was only in the business of protecting property rights, right, no firm would gain to actually try to have a man on the inside. Now, even the Pope Francis has been talking very critically of capitalism, but I would let the religious thing to the religious people, but I will say that my understanding of his understanding of capitalism is like it's hardly free enterprise. In his native Argentina, right, capitalism isn't free enterprise. In fact, cronyism is so rampant that the Spanish word for businessman is empresario, which is also a euphemism for criminals. I mean, again, remember, I mean, when this is the background, the cultural environment in which you're raised, I mean, it's hardly surprising that you would have a fundamental mistrust of government. But again, you forget the government aspect, it's the existence of government. Michael Moore, right? He famously hates cronyism. He famously hates capitalism. He's made a living of hating capitalism. But if you listen closely to what he says, can I have a sound for this? Yes. Guys? Oh, I don't have a sound. Okay. I can say what I can play Michael Moore for a second if you guys want. I'm gonna try. He's answering a guy in the audience who has a capitalism T-shirt, and he probably asks the question. Actually, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. And what he's saying is basically he's saying, listen, for all my complaining about capitalism and free enterprise, we don't have free enterprise. And that is because what we have is that capitalists they actually don't like competition. I don't do a very good Michael Moore, do I? I can continue pretending to be Michael Moore. So what he's saying is basically capitalists, they hate competition. And in fact, if they could have it their ways, they'd be the only car company in town, they would be the only bank in town, they would be the only hairdresser in town, they would be the only shoemaker in town, right? That's what he's saying. Right now. Right? You can see it? Can see it?
You can read his lips.
Okay. So, now, good for him, right? But it's too bad. Is it fixed or not? No.
You're more credible anyway, so don't worry about it.
Okay. And so it's kind of interesting. It's like, I heard him and I was like, dude, yay, you rock. And so what is it that you're actually going after capitalism in general when actually you identify the problem exactly, right? It's actually capitalists trying to use, the government to be the only game in town, right? And where have I heard this before? Well, Adam Smith. I mean, Michael Moore obviously is not the first to identify this problem of business people not liking competition because competition is hard, right? But what Adam Smith gets, by the way, this is for the 4th book of The Wealth of Nations, but what Adam Smith gets and Michael Moore doesn't quite get completely is that actually the biggest danger and the biggest monopoly that exists is the government's monopoly of the use of force. And the real threat is when business people are trying to use this monopoly to serve their own interest and to shut down competition. And this is what Smith was saying, is like when you hear business people clamor for new laws and regulation, you need to be very scrupulous and to kind of wonder what's happening. Right? I'm going to now have to pretend to be Milton Friedman. This is one of the important nuances that Milton Friedman was making in this awesome clip, which doesn't have sound, where he's saying, I love him, where he's saying basically the biggest threat, right, to economic freedom are intellectuals, but also the business community. And what the point that he makes that is so often misunderstood in the United States and everywhere else, but this is kind of like what I do full-time in the US, is remind the Republican that there is a fundamental difference between being free market and being pro-business. And in fact, it's a radical, it's often, they're at odds with each other. Now, obviously, I'm just following the step and standing on the on the shoulder of giants like Gordon Tullock and James Buchanan when I point out that the biggest threat, capitalism, is cronyism and special privilege. Gordon Tullock, right, he created the economics of privilege and rent-seeking, and his research agenda basically spawned a huge research program that showed the unique role that privileges play in what Menker-Olson calls the rise and fall of nation. And James Buchanan, an incredibly important thinker, when he asked us to consider what a non-discriminatory democracy looks like and what the kind of generality rules look like, he's actually basically is making the case for the kind of institution or solution that we would need to tie the hands of special interest and promote freedom. Now, what Tullock and Buchanan and others have told us is that actually the privilege that privilege, cronyism, however you want to call it, is an extremely destructive economic form. And the difficulty and the thing that's actually kind of makes it so dangerous is like it's not so as in your face as a lot of the other stuff. So, for instance, it undermines competition, and it saddles consumers with higher prices and lower quality. That is very, very, very hard for people to realize how hurt they are by special interest. It retards innovation, which then robs future generation of opportunities and higher standards of living. It causes socially destructive pursuit of favors and wastes a lot of resources. One of the things that it does, basically, is that it distorts capital market, but it also encourages people to pursue activities based on tax credits, for instance, rather than actually programs that would have merits, right? And it also, part of this distortion of the allocation of resources is like it actually gives a tremendous incentive, especially in the US, for business people to hire lobbyists to go either fight for protection or for favor instead of actually using this money in ways that are productive. But there's another aspect which in my mind is tremendously important. It is actually, it undermines the legitimacy of businesses in the sense that basically there are more and more people who think that the reason for the success of businesses is that they know someone in government, but it also undermines the legitimacy of government where people have this feeling that government is not so much in the business of general welfare. It is in the business of promoting the welfare of the very few. I mean, this was massively visible in the recent US election with all the talks of the system being rigged, right? Luigi Zingales, who is a professor, he's Italian, he's a professor at the University of Chicago, has this quite amazing statistic, it seems to me, in Italy. I mean, it probably won't surprise you, but I'd be curious what it is in the US now. In Italy, when you ask people, what is the main factor behind business success, 80% will say it's the people you know, rather than your idea, your business model, your ability to complete a project. This is a big threat in and of itself, because once you have so many important institutions being undermined, you would think as a libertarian, I would be like jazzed by it. I used to be, and thinking, hey, yeah, people now know they shouldn't trust government. And the problem is that it actually breeds demand for bigger government. It's kind of like, if you don't trust anyone, just impose whatever it is I want, no matter what, without respect for the rule of law. But perhaps the most important and detrimental thing behind privilege is that it really actually restrains economic freedom. And the reason is fundamentally that behind most intervention in the free market, whether they be taxes and regulation or spending programs, you can trace it down to a special interest that benefits, right? So it's true that progressive politicians suffering from the fatal conceit that they can actually organize effectively society, right? They haven't helped, but they've very often been helped themselves by special interest, guiding them in the kind of intervention to the free market that we've seen. So for instance, right, environmentalists, they weren't behind the ban of, I can never remember that word, my French brand, the incandescent light bulb, this ban. G was arguably much more effective at leading this. It wasn't a progressive president, Obama, that successfully implemented a healthcare insurance mandate. He could do it because he had the financial and political support of the entire insurance industry. We don't have 75,000 pages in the tax code in the United States because it's a socialist paradise. No, it's because mostly you have a lot of interest groups clamoring for special favors for their particular industry. And we don't have over 1 million restrictions in the federal code, regulatory restriction, because that they didn't sprung out all flashed from the brain of, your worst nightmare politicians, or in the US, if you want to blame it on president like FDR, LBJ, and President Obama, right? Behind every single one of these special spending programs, tax loopholes, many of them, regulatory complexity, you find an interest group that stands to benefit. And this is why I say that the real threat, it's not communism. Communism is dead for all intended purposes, especially in the United States. In the Europe, I guess I'm not on quite solid ground giving that talk. And on this side of the Atlantic, same thing. I mean, socialism, again, after this election, I was going to say like the only place in the US where you could run as a socialist was Vermont, but considering the total ecstasy of the younger generation in America, listening to Senator Bernie Sanders, again, I'm not sure I'm on solid ground anymore, but I still think actually that there is something to be said about this. So the real threat is really cronyism and special privilege. And the thing that people don't see, again, it's not so much in your face First, there's just not that many people who think about it. For instance, if you think about the budgetary cost of corporate welfare in America is very small. It's $150 billion. It's not that it's very small, but the government is almost spending $4 trillion, right? $150 billion is a drop of water, right, in this massive ocean of government spending. But what is worst about this is not so much the budgetary cost, it's actually all the perverse incentive and the distortion of capital markets, and that comes with the government picking winners and losers. And this is why, I mean, we were talking at lunch, right? One of the things that sometimes really scares me is like when I look at the Fortune 500 companies, I mean, so many of these of these big, giant, successful companies, so much of their business model relies on government contracts, on government favors, on government carving out special interest. So I want to go very quickly with the time, and by the way, one final point on this. So it's not that visible, but make no mistake, special interests are extremely well organized. And one of the reasons why government grows, right, it's because the benefits are concentrated while the cost of the government is actually spread throughout. And this is particularly true of cronyism, where the people who are the beneficiaries of the government program, of the rent, of the monopoly, of the subsidy, of the loan guarantee, right? They have a strong incentive of protecting their turfs and actually investing money in protecting it. And they can be like out there on Capitol Hill in the US and however you guys do it here, like lobbying and saying, I love that program. Look, I'm a small business. SBA, I just couldn't do it without it. But you don't see all the unseen victims. The person who's, the small business who is now forced to compete with another small business who's benefited from a loan guarantee and got like much lower financing cost and hence has an edge over that person. You don't see the exporter who are using Boeing planes to ship their stuff abroad and who pay more for that export because Boeing is massively subsidized by the federal government. So it is very, very insidious, and you don't see it. People think to stop being obsessed with something that doesn't matter, but it actually matters because it is at the core of what capitalism is, and it's perverting it in an important way. I want to go very, very quickly through the different type of privileges. If you, this is based on a study that my colleague Matt Mitchell, who is he directs basically the program on cronyism, we don't call it this way, at Mercatus. He's a wonderful scholar. If you can read anything by Matt Mitchell, you will always learn something. He wrote this study because if you remember the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? The Occupy Wall Street movement was an interesting moment, right? In America and in America, but also around Europe, right? Where people were right. I agreed with them. There is something that's profoundly, disturbing about all these Wall Street bailouts and financial sector bailout, but where, again, they totally misunderstood that this symptoms is caused mostly by the existence of government giving a privilege to a special interest group. And so Matt put this typology of privileges to tell people bailouts is just one of the many, many ways special interests in Wall Street benefits. So what are they? Very quickly. Well, farm subsidy, obviously in Europe, right? In Europe and the US, farm subsidies, there's a lot of it. The farmers, they used to be pretty much everyone at some point, everywhere, and now they're represented in the US less than 2% of the population. They also overrepresented in top income quintile, and yet they get massive amount of subsidies and they can't be touched. Regulations, I'm not going to go over this. Philip talked about this a lot. This is very insidious. It's very hard to get rid of it. There is some hope that with the new administration, some of it will be addressed. by the way, that's Matt's daughter, and he keeps saying that we put her on this presentation because she's cuter than my kids, but it's not true. It's just my kids are teenagers, right? We won't be using her pictures when she's a teenager. I'll put that on the record. So bailouts, obviously, tax credits. I mean, right now there's a debate over of all the tax credits that exist, not all the 19 for the green energy monopoly. Obviously, you know that there's a monopoly to the access of your mailbox. This is true pretty much everywhere, and there's no reason for it. Loan guarantee is a special dark place in my heart because it is one of the most kind of misunderstood form of privilege. People can make claims like, oh, but they don't cost anything. In fact, they return money to Treasury and blah, blah, blah. It's actually really not true. And very often these saving costs on borrowing go to people who have access to capital. In the case of the Export-Import Bank, you know, abroad, it's like Pemex, you know, ginormous state-owned oil and gas companies abroad, and anyway, it's incredibly pervasive and invisible. So I hate it even more. Trade protections, obviously, big rebirth. Unfortunately, in the U.S., kind of like breaks my heart because I thought we had won that battle, that intellectual battle. And no competitive bidding, basically. Like this is like direct access to special interests where there's not even like a debate. It's like, here you go. You don't even have to make the case that you're better to actually fulfill this contract. How much more time do I have? 2 minutes. Okay, so what do we do? There's a lot of things we can do, but I think, like everything else, there's no silver bullet. If I were tyrant for a day in the US, which would never happen for so many reasons, but if I were, right, I mean, Hayek's always a good place to go. Hayek, Buchanan, and just like, you know, just banned any special favors, right? The generality rule is good for a reason. And that's a good place to go. But in the short term, there's just a lot of ways to expose cronyism. Force government agency to start reporting their financial liability like a private company. So for instance, those loan guarantees, the only reason why they look as if they're turning a profit for the British government, because I can guarantee you there's the same in Britain, the French government, or the US, is because they use a form of accounting that is just completely, it's completely different, right? They don't have to assess risks in the same way. And yet, so those government like agencies that reckon these ginormous amount of liabilities that are just poorly assessed. Maybe the silver lining of this is like, again, because the money are going to usually big company who would have access to capital. There's very little risk of default sometimes, with the exception of when you have a major financial crisis and all this comes to bear and taxpayers have to shoulder these major liability at a time where they can't. I could have gone forever and ever and ever, and I could have bored you with my fight against the Export-Import Bank, along with so many others in Washington. We've been fighting so hard and having some victory in that area, but I will stop here.